All right, get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into psychic vampires. I know what you're thinking. Fangs and capes. Maybe even the thriller dance. But hold on. But today we're moving past the spooky stereotypes and exploring a fascinating phenomenon that might be closer to home than you think. Have you ever felt totally drained after being around someone? Like all your energy just got siphoned off? Well, you might have encountered a psychic vampire.
It really is a fascinating topic, and it's important to clarify that we're not talking about creatures of the night here. Psychic vampires are real people who often don't even realize they're draining the energy of those around them.
Okay, that's both creepy and intriguing. So no garlic needed. But how can we actually identify these energy-sapping people? What are the signs?
Well, it comes down to understanding the way human energy works. Just imagine that every interaction you have involves an exchange of energy. Sometimes it's balanced and mutually beneficial for everyone involved, but other times it can become uneven, leaving one person feeling depleted while the other seems to thrive.
So it's less about supernatural powers and more about the psychology of these interactions. You know, our source material mentions this thing called the command to look, which sounds a little ominous. Can you explain what exactly that is?
The command to look is basically a framework for understanding how psychic vampires capture our attention and energy. They have three main tactics they use: sex, sentiment, and wonder. So it's about them manipulating your natural desire to connect and feel empathy or just be intrigued by something.
So like someone playing the damsel in distress would be using sentiment.
Yeah.
And then a braggart who can't stop talking about their achievements might be trying to evoke wonder, right?
Exactly. And here's the thing. Psychic vampires tend to be drawn to people who are naturally giving and empathetic. They specifically target those who are most likely to fall for these tactics and pour their energy into the interaction.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So how do these tactics actually show up in real-life situations? Do you have any examples?
Sure, think about the person who always has to be the center of attention. They're always fishing for compliments or playing the victim to get sympathy. That's sentiment in action. Or someone who brags constantly about all their achievements, trying to make you feel inferior. That's how they use wonder to pull your energy toward them.
You know, now that you mention it, I can think of a few people who might fit that description. The source material also talks about this idea of selling your soul, which sounds pretty intense. How does that connect to this whole psychic vampire thing?
That selling your soul metaphor is a great way to describe how psychic vampires make you feel indebted to them. They shower you with gifts, do you favors you didn't ask for, or just constantly praise you, all to create a sense of obligation.
So they're basically setting you up to feel like you owe them something.
Yeah.
Which makes it a lot harder to say no to their energy draining requests later on, right?
Exactly. And it's often very subtle. It's almost like a slow drip, draining your energy over time. You might not even notice it's happening until you're feeling totally depleted.
Okay, this is getting a little too real for me. But before I start getting paranoid at every social gathering, let's talk about anger for a second.
Anger is a fascinating aspect of these dynamics. On the one hand, a psychic vampire might use anger to intimidate or control you. They get their way by making you feel scared or guilty. But on the other hand, the person being drained may need to tap into their own anger to set boundaries and protect themselves.
Oh, wow. So anger can actually be a tool for both the vampire and the victim. That's a really interesting perspective.
It is. And recognizing how anger shows up in these types of relationships can help you understand the power dynamics at play.
Now, this might seem a little random, but this whole power dynamic thing makes me think of something from the source material. The appeal of Satanism, specifically as it's described in the Satanic Bible. Do you think there could be a connection between certain aspects of this philosophy and the mindset of the psychic vampire?
That's a really astute observation. And while it's super important to avoid stereotypes and generalizations, it is interesting to consider that the Satanic Bible really emphasizes personal power and indulgence. It encourages rejecting traditional morality that might get in the way of personal gain. And so some people who show these psychic vampire tendencies, especially those who are seeking power by manipulating others, might find this philosophy appealing.
So it's like they view the 7 deadly sins not as sins, but as a roadmap to getting what they want. Fascinating. And maybe a little scary too.
It is, but remember, we're talking about a whole range of behaviors here. Not everyone who shows a few of these traits is a full-blown psychic vampire. The key is to understand the underlying psychology, which can help all of us become more aware of our own energy and how it affects those around us.
And that brings us to the most important question. How do we actually protect ourselves from these energy drainers? Don't go anywhere, listeners, because in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore some practical strategies for setting boundaries, reclaiming your energy, and maybe even finding a way to feel compassion for those who might be unintentionally draining you. Right, so now we know there might be some psychic vampires in our lives. The big question is, how do we protect ourselves? Do we have to become hermits or start wearing garlic necklaces?
That's a great question. And luckily, there are other ways to protect yourself. It all comes down to understanding boundaries and using them to protect your energy. Think of boundaries as like an energy shield that you can use to protect yourself from people who might be trying to drain your energy, even if they don't realize they're doing it.
So boundaries are like our own personal force fields. I like that. But what does that look like in practice? Do I need to cut off all contact with every energy vampire I know?
Not necessarily, no. It's more about being able to recognize when your energy is being drained, and then having the courage to say no when you need to. Remember, you have the right to protect your own well-being, even if it means saying no to someone else.
I feel like that's a really hard thing for a lot of people, especially those who are naturally giving and empathetic. You know, the people who tend to be prime targets for psychic vampires, as we talked about earlier. Do you have any tips on how to say no without feeling like you're being mean?
It's really about finding that balance between being assertive and being compassionate. You can acknowledge the other person's feelings without giving in to their demands. For example, if you have a friend who's always calling to complain about things, you could say something like, "I care about you and I want to be there for you, but I'm feeling a little drained right now. Can we talk later?"
That's a really good example. It sets a clear boundary, but it's still kind and caring. What about those really persistent energy vampires? The ones who just don't take no for an answer?
Yeah, sometimes you might need to be a little more direct. It's okay to say things like, "I can't help you with that right now," or "I just need some space." You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. Prioritizing your own well-being is always okay.
That reminds me of that selling your soul metaphor we talked about before. If we start setting boundaries, do you think those psychic vampires might try to guilt trip us even more?
That's definitely a possibility. They might try to make you feel obligated or even question your loyalty to them. But it's really important to stay strong and stick to your boundaries when you can recognize their manipulation tactics. It's easier to detach from their attempts to control your energy.
Okay, so boundaries are super important. But I have a feeling it takes more than just saying no to build up that resilience to energy vampires.
You're absolutely right. Boundaries are kind of like your first line of defense. But we also need to actively practice things that strengthen our own energy field.
Ooh, okay, now this is getting really interesting. Tell us the secrets. How can we build up those energetic shields?
Well, there are a lot of powerful techniques out there. And the great thing is, they're all available to everyone. One of the most effective techniques is meditation.
Okay, I've heard about meditation, but I'm not sure I'm very good at it. My mind tends to race, like a hamster on a wheel. Do you have any tips for beginners?
The most important thing is to be patient with yourself and start small. Even just a few minutes each day can make a big difference. Just focus on your breath, notice your thoughts without judging them, and picture yourself surrounded by a protective bubble of white light.
I like that visual, that's great. It's like building our own energy force field. Are there other practices we can try?
Spending time in nature is incredibly grounding and revitalizing. You can go for a walk in the park, sit by a lake, or even just stand barefoot on the grass. Connecting with nature can really help replenish your energy and clear out any negativity.
I'm all about the power of nature. It's like hitting the reset button for your mind and body.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of creativity, whether it's painting, writing, dancing, or playing music. Doing things you enjoy can be incredibly energizing and help you reconnect with your own inner power.
It feels like you're giving us a whole toolkit for not just surviving, but thriving, even in a world where we might run into energy vampires. This is great. But before we get too carried away with our newfound energetic superpowers, I think there's one more important element we need to talk about.
I agree, and it might sound a little counterintuitive, but it's really essential for handling these complex dynamics with grace and understanding.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. We're going to have to save this last piece of the puzzle for the final part of our deep dive. Don't go anywhere, listeners. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We've been talking all about psychic vampires, how to spot them, protect our energy, and even recharge. But I think there's one more thing we need to cover. What's this crucial element you mentioned before the break?
It's all about cultivating compassion, not just for ourselves, but also for those people who might be exhibiting those energy-draining behaviors.
Wait, compassion for psychic vampires, isn't that kind of letting them off the hook?
Not at all. It's about understanding that most of the time, psychic vampires aren't intentionally trying to hurt others. They might be acting out of their own insecurities, unmet needs, maybe even past traumas. They might not even realize the impact their behavior has on the people around them.
So instead of viewing them as the bad guy, we should be trying to understand why they're acting that way.
Exactly. When we approach these relationships with compassion, we can detach from judgment and really see the situation more clearly. It doesn't mean we have to condone their behavior or become doormats. It just means we can set boundaries with more understanding and less resentment.
You know, this makes me think about how complex energy dynamics can be.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes we're the psychic vampire without even knowing it.
That's a great point. You're absolutely right. We all have the potential to show some of those energy draining tendencies, especially when we're stressed, feeling insecure, or just not at our best. It's about becoming more self-aware so we can recognize those patterns in ourselves.
I've never thought about it that way before. I can definitely think of times when I've leaned on my friends for support, maybe overshared or complained a little too much. I never stopped to think about how that might have affected them energetically.
And that's a perfect example of how we can all benefit from being more mindful of our own energy and how it affects those around us. It's not about beating ourselves up for the past. It's about using that awareness to make more conscious choices moving forward.
So the key takeaway here is to practice compassion for ourselves and for those who might be draining our energy without realizing it. It's about understanding the psychology behind these behaviors and approaching these relationships with more awareness and empathy.
You said it perfectly. By recognizing that everyone is human, even those who might trigger those energy-draining defenses in us, we can navigate all these complex dynamics with a lot more grace and understanding.
This has been a really insightful look into psychic vampires. We've gone from being afraid of those energy-sucking shadows to recognizing the importance of boundaries, self-care, and even compassion.
And don't forget, this is an ongoing process. The more we learn about energy dynamics, the better equipped we'll be to create balanced and fulfilling relationships. Relationships that nourish us instead of draining us.
I hope you all enjoyed this deep dive into the world of psychic vampires. Remember, knowledge is power, and armed with the tools and insights we've talked about today, you're ready to navigate your own energy landscape with confidence and grace. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those energy reserves topped up.